Lieutenant Robert Bob Campbell stared at what was left of his B-17's right wing and made a decision that every pilot in the European theater would have called suicide. The outer 20 feet were just gone, sheared clean off by a direct flak hit over Bremen. The bomber was rolling hard to the left, the controls fighting him like a living thing that wanted to die. His co-pilot was screaming numbers that made no sense. Airspeed dropping, altitude bleeding away. 9 men depending on him to do the impossible. And Campbell, 23 years old with a face that still looked too young to shave, pushed the throttles forward instead of giving the bailout order. This is the story of All-American, a flying fortress that should have broken apart in the German sky, a crew that should have become another statistic in the bloody arithmetic of the bomber war, and a flight home that Luftwaffe intelligence officers would later describe in their reports as physically impossible. But it happened. February 1943. The 8th Air Force was learning hard lessons over occupied Europe. Every mission was a calculated trade. We'll lose this many bombers to destroy that target. We'll sacrifice this many crews to draw up these fighters. The numbers were brutal and honest. Bomber Command didn't dress it up. You had a 1 in 4 chance of completing your 25-mission tour. Those were the odds. You knew them before you ever climbed into that freezing aluminum tube at 4 in the morning. Campbell's crew was assigned to the 97th Bombardment Group, the first heavy bomb group to arrive in England. They weren't green anymore. This was their 19th mission. They'd seen Berlin. They'd seen the fighters come in 12 o'clock high with their cannons winking. They'd seen B-17s fold in half when a bomb load cooked off. They'd counted the parachutes and done the math on who didn't make it back. But nothing prepares you for the moment your aircraft becomes a flying contradiction of physics. The target was the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen. Strategic, important, heavily defended. The kind of mission where you checked your parachute 3 times and made sure your letters home were up to date. They'd crossed the coast at 23,000 feet in a tight formation that looked perfect from the ground. Textbook, like the training films. But up there in the frozen sky with the contrails marking you for every gun crew in northern Germany, textbook doesn't mean safe. The flak started before they reached the initial point. Campbell saw the black puffs blooming ahead of them like some kind of evil garden. The German 80mm guns were good, terrifyingly good. They could put a shell into a basketball-sized space at 20,000 feet. And when you're flying straight and level on your bomb run, you're not dodging anything. You're holding steady. You're trusting that the math of probability will let you through. The first hit took out the number 3 engine. Campbell felt it more than heard it, a shudder that ran through the whole airframe. Then the prop was windmilling, and oil was streaming back, coating the fuselage in black streaks. Standard emergency. They'd trained for this. 3 engines could get you home. The formation tightened up around them. Other B-17s moving in to fill the gap, to keep the defensive firepower concentrated. They were 2 minutes from bombs away when the second shell found them. Campbell said later that he thought the wing had just exploded. 1 second it was there. The next second there was nothing but a jagged edge and daylight where 20 feet of wing used to be. The bomber snapped left so hard that it threw the navigator against the bulkhead. The ball turret gunner thought they were going into a death spiral. In the radio room, the operator was already reaching for his chest pack, ready to jump. But Campbell didn't give the order. He was fighting the yoke with everything he had. Both hands, both feet on the rudders. The co-pilot, Lieutenant John Thompson, grabbed the yoke on his side and added his strength. Together they were barely holding the bomber level. The airspeed was dropping through 140 miles per hour, the stall speed for a B-17 at combat weight. They should have been falling out of the sky, except they weren't. All-American was still flying. Campbell's flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Joe Ramirez, appeared behind the pilots. His face was white. He'd crawled out along the catwalk to look at the damage. What he'd seen didn't make sense. The wing spar was exposed. You could see right through the structure. The control surfaces were gone. The aileron on that side was just hanging by cables. By every principle of aerodynamics that these men had learned, this aircraft was already dead. But she was holding together. Campbell made the call. They weren't bailing out. They were going home. The bombardier had already salvoed the bombs. No point carrying that weight. Every pound mattered now. They dropped out of formation, a wounded bird leaving the pack. The other B-17s continued to the target. Campbell couldn't blame them. Formation integrity meant survival. A single bomber was easy prey for fighters. But All-American couldn't keep up, couldn't maintain altitude, couldn't do anything but limp west and hope. The German fighters found them over the North Sea. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s came in from 4 o'clock high. Predators that knew a kill when they saw one. Campbell watched them approach in his mirror. His gunners were calling out positions. The top turret was tracking them. The waist guns were ready. But everyone knew this was bad. A healthy B-17 in formation could put up a wall of 50 caliber fire. A crippled bomber alone was just target practice. The first 190 came in fast. His cannons opened up at 400 yards. Campbell felt the rounds hit, heard them punching through aluminum. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit. But then the top turret spoke. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a kid from Chicago who'd worked in his father's butcher shop before the war, walked his tracers right into the 190's engine, cowling. 50 caliber rounds at 10 rounds per second. The Focke-Wulf's nose lit up. Pieces of cowling flew off. The fighter broke away, trailing smoke. The second 190 pulled up, circled, watching. Campbell didn't understand it at first. Then Thompson said it quietly. He's calling it in. He's getting friends. But the friends never came. Later, Campbell would learn that a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts had been vectored to their position. The German pilot had seen them coming and decided his life was worth more than one crippled bomber. It was the kind of small miracle that war sometimes offers. The random alignment of timing and position that means you get to see tomorrow. The P-47s formed up on all-American, like an honor guard, 8 Thunderbolts, sleek and deadly. They stayed with the B-17 all the way to the English coast. The bomber was down to 8,000 feet now, still descending. The controls were getting worse. Campbell and Thompson were both soaked with sweat despite the cold. Their arms were shaking from the effort of holding the yoke. England appeared through the haze, green fields, home. But Campbell had another problem: landing. The tower at their base had been notified. They were clearing the field. Ambulances and fire trucks were rolling. The rest of the group had already landed from the mission. Crews were gathering near the runway. Everyone wanted to see if it was possible. Campbell set up his approach with the delicacy of a surgeon. Too slow and they'd stall. Too fast and the damaged wing might fold. He couldn't use normal flap settings. The asymmetric lift would roll them inverted. Thompson had the gear down. The airspeed was holding at 110. The numbers looked wrong, but there was no other choice. They came over the fence and Campbell eased the throttles back. The good wing wanted to stay up. The damaged wing wanted to drop. He was working the rudders constantly, making tiny corrections. The runway was rising up. Thompson called out altitude. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30. The wheels kissed the runway so gently that some of the watching crews said it was the smoothest landing they'd ever seen. But the moment the weight settled on the gear, the damaged wing gave up. The whole outboard section folded down. Metal screamed. The wingtip dragged the runway in a shower of sparks. The bomber slewed right. Campbell stood on the left brake. The screeching was incredible, but they were slowing, still on the runway, still in one piece. When All-American finally stopped, there was silence. Then the entire base erupted. Crews came running from every hardstand. Ground personnel poured out of hangars. By the time Campbell shut down the engines, there were 200 men surrounding the bomber. They were staring at the wing, at the massive hole where 20 feet of structure used to be, at the exposed spars and the torn metal, and the absolute impossibility of what they were seeing. Campbell climbed down from the aircraft, and his legs nearly gave out. Thompson caught him. They stood there for a moment. 2 pilots who'd just done something that shouldn't exist. The rest of the crew was gathering. 9 faces. 9 men who should have been scattered across the German countryside in parachutes. 9 men who were standing on English soil because their pilot had refused to accept what was possible. The intelligence officers photographed everything, measured everything, took statements from every crew member. The engineering teams examined the wing structure for 3 days. Their report was precise and damning. The bomber should have suffered immediate catastrophic structural failure. The aerodynamic forces should have torn the wing off completely. The loss of lift should have made controlled flight impossible. But it happened anyway. Luftwaffe reports captured after the war included a notation about a B-17 observed flying with severe wing damage over the North Sea on that date. The German intelligence officer who wrote the report added a comment: "Impossible flight characteristics. Recommend further investigation of American structural engineering." They never understood that it wasn't the engineering. It was Campbell's refusal to quit, Thompson's strength on the yoke, Ramirez's damage assessment that gave them the information they needed, O'Brien's gunnery that drove off the fighters, every man on that crew doing one impossible thing after another until the impossible became real. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. All American never flew combat again. The damage was too extensive, but they didn't scrap her. They repaired that wing and sent her stateside. She became a training aircraft, a teaching tool. Pilots would walk around her, and instructors would point to that wing and say, "This is what a B-17 can survive. This is why we trust these machines." But Campbell knew the truth. It wasn't the machine. It was never the machine. It was the choice. The choice to try when everything says you're finished. The choice to fight the controls for 200 miles when your arms are screaming. The choice to believe that you can do one more impossible thing. Campbell flew 14 more missions after Bremen. He completed his tour and went home to Nebraska in December 1943. He didn't talk much about all-American, case. When people asked, he'd just say they got lucky. But the men who flew with him knew different. They knew what those 2 hours over Germany and the North Sea really were. They were proof that sometimes the difference between a statistic and a story is one man's refusal to accept the math. The photographs of All-American, with her damaged wing, spread through the bomber groups in England like wildfire. Crews would study them before missions. They became a kind of talisman, a reminder that coming home wasn't always about following the manual. Sometimes it was about pushing past what you thought was your limit and finding out you had more. Other crews started reporting similar incidents, not as dramatic, but B-17s coming home with damage that should have killed them. Wings with massive holes, tail sections held on by cables, entire gun positions blown away, and the pilots bringing them down anyway because they'd seen the photos. They knew it could be done. The bomber war over Europe was a mathematician's nightmare. Every mission generated data: bomber loss rates, fighter effectiveness, flak density patterns, target destruction percentages. The analysts in London tracked everything. They built models, they predicted outcomes, and they were usually right, but they couldn't model Campbell. They couldn't put into a formula what happens when a 23-year-old farm kid from North Platte decides that 9 men are going home today and nothing is going to stop that. The equations don't account for stubbornness, for the kind of determination that turns your arms to rubber and keeps you fighting the yoke anyway. Technical Sergeant Ramirez kept a piece of the damaged wing. After the war, he had it mounted in a shadow box with a small plaque. All-American Bremen, February 1943. We made it. It hung in his garage in Los Angeles for 40 years. His grandchildren would ask about it. He'd tell them the story, but he always ended the same way. He'd say, "Bob Campbell gave us something that day. He gave us the belief that we could do the impossible, and once you have that, you carry it forever." The surviving members of Campbell's crew stayed in touch. They had reunions, small gatherings in different cities. They'd sit and talk about the missions, about the men they'd lost, about the war that had shaped them. But Bremen was always special. That mission, that flight, that landing, it represented something that went beyond combat and survival. It represented the moment they learned who they really were. Lieutenant John Thompson, Campbell's co-pilot, went on to fly 29 missions. He survived the war and became a commercial pilot. He flew DC-3s and then DC-6s and eventually 707s for United Airlines. 30 years of flying passengers across America, safe flights, routine flights. But he said that nothing ever matched those 2 hours fighting the controls of All-American. Nothing ever made him feel that alive, that necessary. War does that. It puts you in situations where every decision matters, where hesitation equals death, where the difference between seeing tomorrow and becoming a memory is measured in seconds and inches, and for some men, that clarity becomes the defining experience of their lives, not because they wanted war, but because war revealed capacities they never knew they had. Campbell didn't see himself as a hero. He rejected that word every time someone used it. He'd say he was just doing his job, just bringing his crew home, but the men who flew with him understood the distinction. Doing your job is following procedures. What Campbell did was create new procedures. He wrote the manual on what to do when every manual says you're done. The British press got hold of the story. Newspapers in London ran the photographs. Yank bomber defies death over Bremen. The headlines were dramatic, but the photos sold the story. You couldn't fake that damage. You couldn't stage that wing. The evidence was absolute. This happened. American newspapers picked it up. Campbell's hometown paper in North Platte ran a front-page story with a photo of him standing under the damaged wing. His mother kept that newspaper for the rest of her life. She'd show it to visitors, and her voice would get quiet, and she'd say, "That's my Bobby. He doesn't know how to quit." She was right. The culture of the 8th Air Force changed subtly after Bremen. There was already enormous courage in those bomber crews, already a tradition of pressing on despite losses. But All-American added something else. It added the idea that the margins were wider than anyone thought, that the edge wasn't where the manual said it was, that you could push further. This wasn't recklessness. It was informed courage. Campbell had made his decision based on what his flight engineer told him, based on the controls responding even if they were degraded, based on evidence that the bomber was still flyable. It was calculated, but it required belief that went beyond calculation. Other pilots started bringing damaged bombers home that might have been abandoned earlier in the war. The bailout rate for aircraft with severe damage dropped, not because the bombers were getting tougher, but because the pilots were getting more confident. They'd seen what was possible. They had a new reference point. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The German flak crews over Bremen never knew what they'd created that day. They'd fired their guns according to doctrine. They'd hit their target. The 80mm shell that took off all Americans' wing was a perfectly executed shot. By all rights, it should have been a kill. One more B-17 added to the tally. One more small victory in the war of attrition. But it became something else entirely. It became evidence of what's possible when skill meets determination meets luck and produces something that shouldn't exist. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers who noted the impossible flight in their reports were right to be puzzled. From a technical standpoint, all American was finished the moment that shell hit. The math said so. The physics said so. Campbell said otherwise, and he had the controls. The flight back to England took 2 hours and 17 minutes. Campbell and Thompson fought the yoke for every second of that time. Their hands were cramped, their shoulders were burning, but they never eased off. Never let the bomber settle into a tendency. They flew it, actively, constantly, 200 miles of absolute concentration. The crew in the back watched through the waist gun windows as the damaged wing flexed and bent. They could see the spars working, see the metal moving in ways it wasn't designed to move. Every man back there knew they were in an aircraft that was betraying every principle of structural engineering. But it was still flying, still responding, still taking them west. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Tommy Chen, said later that he spent the entire flight calculating his chances if he had to bail out over the North Sea. Water temperature, survival time, likelihood of rescue. The numbers weren't good. Maybe 20 minutes in the water before hypothermia took you. Maybe 1 chance in 10 of being spotted. He decided that riding the bomber down was better odds, but he didn't have to make that choice. Chen survived the war, went home to San Francisco, opened a restaurant, raised 4 kids, never flew again, never wanted to, but he kept a picture of all American on the wall behind his cash register. Customers would ask about it. He'd tell them a short version of the story, just the facts. Bomber got damaged. Pilot brought it home. Sometimes he'd add, "That pilot saved my life. His name was Bob Campbell, and he was the bravest man I ever knew." Simple, true. The deeper story was harder to tell. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it feels like to be in a machine that's dying? The sounds it makes, the way the vibration changes, the smell of overheated hydraulics and damaged metal, the certain knowledge that you're in something that's coming apart, and there's nothing you can do except trust the men up front. Chen tried once to explain it to his oldest son. They were working in the restaurant kitchen, and his son had asked about the photo. Chen stopped chopping vegetables and looked out the window for a long moment. Then he said, "When you're in a situation where you have no control, you find out what kind of men are making the decisions. We had good men, the best. And that's why I'm standing here talking to you instead of being a name on a memorial wall somewhere in Europe. That was the weight of it. Every man on that crew went on to live full lives because of what Campbell decided in those seconds after the wing came off. Marriages, children, grandchildren, careers, entire branches of family trees that exist because one pilot pushed the throttles forward instead of giving the bailout order. The mathematics of that decision ripple forward in ways that can't be calculated. Technical Sergeant Ramirez had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren. Every single one of them exists because Ramirez didn't bail out over Bremen, because Campbell brought him home. That's 1 crew member. Multiply that by 9. The number becomes staggering. The real victory wasn't just landing the bomber, it was everything that came after. Campbell understood this later in life, after the war, after he'd gone back to farming in Nebraska, after he'd married and raised his own family. He'd sit on his porch in the evening, and sometimes his mind would drift back to that mission, to those 2 hours, to the decision that defined him. He never regretted it, not once. Even when his hands would shake sometimes from the memory of fighting those controls, even when he'd wake up from dreams where the wing was folding and they were going down, he knew he'd made the right choice. He'd trusted his training, trusted his aircraft, trusted his crew, and they'd all come through. That's what leadership looks like when everything is falling apart. Not speeches, not inspiration, just cold assessment of the situation and the will to act on the best information available. Campbell had seconds to decide. He chose life. He chose to fight. and his crew followed him because they trusted that he knew what he was doing. That trust wasn't automatic, it was earned. Mission after mission. Landing after landing. The quiet competence that Campbell showed every time he flew. His crew knew he wasn't reckless, knew he wouldn't throw their lives away. So when he made the call to stay with the aircraft, they believed him. They trusted that he'd seen something in the damage assessment that gave him confidence. He had. Ramirez's report from the wing had been specific. The main spar was damaged but intact. The control cables were still connected. The structural failure was extensive but not complete. That was the information Campbell needed. It wasn't a miracle. It was engineering and luck and skill all converging, but it required someone to act on that information. Someone to say, "We can do this." The post-mission debrief at their base lasted for hours. Intelligence officers asked the same questions in different ways. How fast were you flying? What was the aircraft attitude? How did the controls respond? They were trying to understand, trying to build a technical picture of what had happened. But some of their questions didn't have answers. How did you know it would hold together? Campbell's answer was simple. I didn't know, but I knew bailing out over Germany meant prisoner camp at best. I knew the North Sea would kill us, and I knew the aircraft was still responding to control inputs. So we flew. Logical, clear. The kind of thinking that separates competent pilots from exceptional ones. The Air Force analyzed the mission data for months. They brought in structural engineers from right field. They examined every inch of all Americans' damaged wing. They ran calculations on stress loads and aerodynamic forces. Their conclusion was technical and precise. Flight should not have been possible with damage of this severity. Contributing factors to successful return: pilot skill, reduced aircraft weight after bomb release, favorable wind conditions, crew coordination, and a phrase they added almost reluctantly: structural integrity exceeding design specifications. The B-17 was tougher than even Boeing knew. That became part of the bomber's legend. The stories spread through the aviation industry. Engineers who worked on the B-17 program would talk about all-American with pride. They'd built something that could take unimaginable damage and still fly. But they also knew that without a pilot like Campbell, that toughness meant nothing. The machine and the man had to match. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Campbell received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the Bremen mission. The citation was formal and military, but the medal meant less to him than the letter he got from Tommy Chen's mother. She wrote to thank him for bringing her son home. Her English wasn't perfect, but her meaning was clear. She said Campbell had given her family back to her, that she prayed for him every day, that she would never forget what he'd done. Campbell kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. He'd pull it out sometimes when people asked about the war, when they wanted to hear about the dramatic moments in the combat. He'd show them the letter and say, "This is why it mattered. Not the medals, not the headlines. This, the human cost, the human reward." War strips everything down to essential truths. You learn quickly what matters and what doesn't. The bureaucracy and the politics and the grand strategy all fade away when you're at 20,000 feet with half a wing gone. What remains is simple. Get your people home. Do your job. Make the next right decision. Campbell made a lot of right decisions that day. The decision to stay with the aircraft. The decision to maintain airspeed even as they lost altitude. The decision to accept the P-47 escort instead of trying to navigate alone. The decision to set up a long, gentle approach instead of rushing the landing. Each choice built on the previous one. Each choice shaped the outcome. And at the end of that chain of decisions was 9 men walking away from an aircraft that shouldn't have made it home. The other pilots in the 97th Bomb Group treated Campbell differently after Bremen. Not obviously, not dramatically, but there was a respect that went beyond the normal camaraderie. When Campbell walked into the officers' club, conversations would pause, men would nod, buy him drinks, want to hear the story directly. But Campbell didn't enjoy the attention. He'd deflect, change the subject, talk about other crews and other missions. He understood instinctively that making yourself the center of the story was dangerous. It created pressure, expectations. The next mission wouldn't care about what you did last time. The flak wouldn't avoid you because you'd done something remarkable. Every mission started from zero. That humility kept him alive. Pilots who believed their own legends got careless, started taking risks that weren't justified. Campbell never did that. Mission 20 after Bremen was approached with the same careful preparation as Mission 19. Same checklist, same procedures, same focus. The only difference was that his crew trusted him even more. Thompson, his co-pilot, said later that flying with Campbell after Bremen was like flying with someone who'd proven they could handle anything. There was no what-if scenario that seemed impossible anymore. Engine failure? Campbell could handle it. Structural damage? Campbell could handle it. Fighter attack? Campbell could handle it. That confidence made the crew more effective. They took on difficult missions without hesitation, volunteered for dangerous targets, not because they were reckless, but because they believed in their pilot. And that belief translated into better performance, better gunnery, better navigation, better everything. Trust is the force multiplier that no military manual can quantify. Campbell completed his 25th mission in June 1943. He'd made it, against the odds, against the statistics, against everything that said he should be dead or captured or missing. He'd brought his crew through 25 missions over occupied Europe, and they'd all survived. That was rare. Most bomber crews lost at least one man during a tour. Engine failures, fighter attacks, flak, operational accidents. The attrition was constant, but Campbell's crew stayed intact. 9 men who started together, 9 men who finished together. When they walked away from their final mission, there wasn't celebration. There was relief, exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from months of fear and stress and survival. They shook hands, promised to stay in touch, and then they scattered to different assignments or rotation home. Campbell left England in July 1943, boarded a transport back to the States, watched Europe disappear behind him, and felt nothing but numbness. He'd given everything to those 25 missions, everything he had, and now it was done. The transition to peacetime took years. Campbell tried to go back to farming, but the quiet bothered him. The lack of purpose, the absence of the stakes that had defined every day in England. He'd get up in the morning and work the fields, and it all felt empty, meaningless. What was growing corn compared to bringing 9 men home through impossible circumstances? He struggled. A lot of veterans did. The war had given them an intensity of experience that normal life couldn't match. They'd been tested in ways that most people never are. They'd found capacities in themselves that only emerge under extreme pressure, and then they were expected to just slide back into civilian existence like none of it had happened. It didn't work that way. Campbell found his purpose eventually. He became a flight instructor, teaching young pilots the basics of aviation, how to handle controls, how to read instruments, how to make decisions under pressure. He was good at it, patient, thorough. He understood that the technical skills were important, but the mental game was everything. He'd tell his students about Bremen sometimes, not as a story of heroism, as a lesson in decision-making. He'd say, "You'll have moments where everything tells you to quit, where the situation looks impossible, and in those moments, you have to assess what you actually know versus what you fear. Then you act on the knowledge." Simple wisdom, hard-earned. Campbell taught flying for 20 years. Hundreds of students. Some of them went on to military careers. Some became airline pilots, some just flew for pleasure. But all of them carried something from Campbell. A way of thinking about problems, a refusal to panic, a belief that most impossible situations have solutions if you're willing to look hard enough. That was his legacy. Not just the one impossible flight, but decades of passing on the lessons learned from that flight. The knowledge that you're capable of more than you think, that machines can be pushed beyond their limits if you understand them. That fear is information, not a command. Campbell died in 1989. He was 69 years old. His funeral in North Platte was attended by hundreds of people, former students, fellow veterans, members of his crew who traveled from across the country to pay their respects. They told stories, shared memories, talked about what Campbell had meant to them. Tommy Chen spoke at the service. He was 72 then, still running his restaurant in San Francisco. He told the story of Bremen, the whole story, and he ended by saying, "Bob Campbell gave me 66 years I shouldn't have had. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment with my children and grandchildren. All of it is because one man decided we weren't finished yet." That's not just heroism. That's love. Love for his crew, love for life, love for doing the right thing even when it's hard. The church was silent. Then someone started clapping. It built slowly. A few people, then more. Then everyone was standing and applauding. For Campbell, for what he'd done, for what he'd represented, for the simple truth that one person can make a difference. All-American was scrapped in 1946. The war was over. The massive bomber fleet was being reduced. Aircraft that had fought across Europe were being cut up for aluminum. It was practical, economical, but the people who'd flown in those bombers felt the loss. Each B-17 had a story. Each one had carried men into combat and brought some of them home. They were more than machines. They were partners, crew members, the 10th man in a 9-man crew. And when they were destroyed, something was lost. but the stories remained. The photographs of All American are still in the Air Force archives, black and white images of a bomber with half a wing, proof that it happened, evidence of the impossible made real. Every few years, someone discovers those photos again, publishes them online, shares them, and a new generation learns about Bob Campbell and his crew and the flight that shouldn't have succeeded. The story resonates because it speaks to something fundamental. We all face moments where we're damaged, where we've lost something essential, where the easy choice is to quit. And in those moments, we need to know that continuing is possible, that we can function even when we're broken, that we can make it home. Campbell proved it's possible, not easily, not without cost, but possible. And sometimes that's all we need, not a guarantee, just possibility. The knowledge that someone else faced impossible odds and came through. That creates belief, and belief creates action, and action creates outcomes that change everything. That's the real story of All American, not just a damaged bomber that made it home, but a demonstration of what's possible when courage meets skill meets determination. A lesson that rippled through the 8th Air Force and changed how pilots thought about survival. A legacy that extended far beyond one mission. Campbell would have been embarrassed by this analysis. He'd say he was just doing his job, just being a pilot. But the men who flew with him knew better. They understood that what he did over Bremen and the North Sea was exceptional, that most pilots would have given the bailout order, that Campbell's choice to stay with the aircraft was the difference between life and death for 9 men. Exceptional doesn't mean perfect. Campbell made mistakes during his tour, had rough landings, made navigation errors. He was human, fallible, but when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, he made the right choice. He fought for his crew. He refused to accept defeat. He brought them home. That's what heroes do, not because they're fearless, but because they're more afraid of failing their people than they are of dying. Campbell was terrified that day. He said so later. His hands were shaking, his mouth was dry. Every instinct was screaming at him to bail out, but he didn't, because 9 men were depending on him, and that responsibility outweighed the fear. Responsibility, the word that defined the greatest generation. They didn't ask for the war, didn't want it, but when it came, they stepped up. They did what was necessary. They sacrificed and fought and died for something larger than themselves, and the ones who came home carried that sense of responsibility for the rest of their lives. Campbell carried it. You could see it in how he taught, how he interacted with his students, how he lived his life. Everything he did was shaped by those 2 hours over Germany and the North Sea, by the knowledge that he'd been trusted with 9 lives and he'd honored that trust. He never forgot, never let himself forget, because forgetting would diminish what those men had given him, their trust, their belief, their willingness to follow him into the impossible and come out the other side. That's a debt you can never repay. You can only try to be worthy of it, to live a life that justifies the faith people placed in you. Campbell did that. For 46 years after Bremen, he woke up every day and tried to be the man his crew believed he was. Most days he succeeded. The measure of a life isn't perfection. It's effort, direction, the consistent attempt to do right even when it's hard. Campbell embodied that. He wasn't a saint, wasn't superhuman. He was a farm kid from Nebraska who learned to fly and found himself in a war he never asked for, but he rose to meet it. He became what his crew needed him to be, and in doing so, he became something more, a symbol of what's possible when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and refuse to surrender, of the power of skill and courage and stubborn determination, of the truth that we're all capable of more than we know. Campbell's story isn't just about one flight, it's about all of us, about the moments we'll face when everything seems impossible, when we're damaged and afraid and the easy path is to quit. Those moments define us, and Campbell's example shows us that we can rise to meet them. We can push the throttles forward instead of bailing out. We can fight the controls for 200 miles even when our arms are screaming. We can bring ourselves and our people home even when everything says it can't be done. We can do the impossible, because Campbell did it first, and he showed us how. That's why this story matters. That's why it deserves to be remembered, not as ancient history, not as a dusty tale from a forgotten war, but as a living example of human capacity, of what we can achieve when we refuse to accept limits. The B-17 with half a wing came home, against physics, against logic, against every reasonable expectation. It came home because one pilot believed it could and 9 men believed in him. That's not a miracle. That's humanity at its finest, and it's worth remembering, always, because the next time you face your own impossible moment, you'll remember Bob Campbell and All American. You'll remember that someone else has been where you are, Someone else has stared at the broken wing and made the choice to try anyway, and if they could do it, maybe you can too. That's the gift Campbell gave us. Not just that one impossible flight, but the belief that impossible is negotiable, that the edge is further out than we think, that we have reserves of strength and courage we haven't tapped yet. All we have to do is push the throttles forward and see what happens. Campbell did, and he made it home. So can we. The years after the war brought changes that Campbell never anticipated. The world moved fast. Jet engines replaced propellers. The B-17 became obsolete almost overnight. By 1950, the mighty flying fortress was a museum piece, a relic of a different kind of warfare. But the lessons learned in those bombers remained relevant. Campbell watched the Korean War from a distance. He was too old for recall, too far removed from active service. But he followed the news. Read about the B-29 raids over North Korea, the fighter sweeps, the close air support missions, and he recognized the same patterns. Young men facing impossible situations, making split-second decisions, living or dying based on skill and luck and determination. He wanted to tell them what he'd learned, wanted to pass on the knowledge that had kept him alive. But there was no mechanism for that, no way to reach across the gap between veteran and active duty. So he did what he could. He taught his students. He trained the next generation of civilian pilots. And he hoped that somehow the lessons would filter through. They did, in ways Campbell never knew about. One of his students became a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. Another flew for the CIA during the Cold War. Another became an instructor himself and passed on Campbell's methods to hundreds more. The ripples spread outward, each student touching other lives, each lesson multiplying across time and distance. That's how wisdom survives. Not through grand gestures, through quiet transmission, teacher to student, generation to generation, the accumulated knowledge of those who've been tested and survived. Campbell's methods were simple but profound. Always have an out. Always know your aircraft's actual limits, not just the book limits. Always trust your instruments, but verify with your senses. Always make decisions based on information, not fear. Simple rules, but they saved lives. One of his students crashed in a thunderstorm in 1967. The aircraft lost an engine, and the electrical system failed. Night. Rain. No instruments. Every reason to panic. But the pilot remembered Campbell's training. He focused on what he could control, felt the aircraft's attitude through the seat of his pants, listened to the remaining engine, flew by instinct and training, and he brought it down in a field, walked away with minor injuries. He wrote to Campbell afterward, said the old lessons had saved his life, that in the moment of crisis, Campbell's voice had been in his head, calm, methodical, telling him what to do next. Campbell kept that letter too, filed it with the one from Chen's mother, evidence that what he'd done mattered beyond just those 9 men on All-American, evidence that teaching was its own kind of combat, its own way of saving lives. The reunions of Campbell's original crew became annual events, every year, same weekend in September. They'd rotate locations, meet in different cities. The gatherings started large, all 9 men, wives, kids, stories and laughter, and the easy camaraderie of shared experience. But time took its toll. Thompson died in 1971. Heart attack. He was 51. Too young. Campbell flew to Chicago for the funeral. Saw his old co-pilot one last time. Remembered the hours they'd spent side by side fighting the controls of All-American, 2 men working as one. Thompson's strength added to his. Without that partnership, they never would have made it. Campbell spoke at the funeral. Kept it short. Said Thompson was the finest co-pilot he'd ever flown with. That he'd trusted him completely. That they'd done something together that neither could have done alone. The widow thanked him afterward, said it meant everything to hear those words from Campbell, that Thompson had talked about Bremen until the day he died, that it had been the defining moment of his life. Another man shaped by those 2 hours, another life given meaning by an impossible flight. The crew reunions continued, but they were smaller now. 8 men instead of 9, then 7, then 6. Age and illness and accidents whittled down the number. Each loss was felt deeply. These weren't just fellow veterans, they were brothers, bonded by shared trauma and shared survival, men who'd seen each other at their worst and their best. By 1980, only 5 remained: Campbell, Chen, Ramirez, O'Brien, from the top turret, and Lieutenant James Morrison, the navigator who'd been thrown against the bulkhead when the wing came off. They met that September in San Francisco, Chen's restaurant, private room, just the 5 of them. They were old men now, in their 60s, hair gray or gone, bodies showing the wear of decades. But when they looked at each other, they saw the young men they'd been, 20-somethings in leather jackets and flight suits, scared and brave and alive in ways they'd never be again. The conversation that night was different, more reflective, less about the war and more about what came after, what it meant to have survived, what they owed to the men who hadn't, how they tried to live lives worthy of the second chance they'd been given. Morrison talked about his kids, 4 of them, all successful, all happy. He said he'd never told them the full story of Bremen, never explained how close they'd come to not existing. He wasn't sure they could understand. The gap between their safe lives and his wartime experience was too wide, but Campbell understood, said he'd felt the same way with his own children. How do you explain to someone who's never faced death what it means to have escaped it? How do you convey the weight of survival, the responsibility that comes with being given tomorrow when so many others weren't? You can't. Not really. You can tell the story, describe the events, but the emotional truth remains locked inside those who lived it. That night in San Francisco, 5 old men sat around a table and shared that emotional truth. No need to explain, no need to justify, they just understood. They'd been there, they knew. Chen raised a glass, said simply, "To Bob, who brought us home?" They drank, silent, remembering. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The 1980s brought renewed interest in World War II history, books, documentaries, the 40th anniversary of various campaigns. Young historians started seeking out veterans, recording their stories, building an oral history archive before the generation was gone. A researcher from the Smithsonian contacted Campbell in 1983, wanted to interview him about Bremen, about All-American, about the impossible flight. Campbell was reluctant at first. He'd spent 40 years deflecting attention, keeping the story small. But the researcher was persistent, explained that these accounts were vanishing, that in another decade there might be no one left who remembered. Campbell agreed. The interview lasted 6 hours. The researcher asked detailed questions. Technical questions about the controls and the damage and the flight characteristics, but also personal questions. What were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did you make the decision? Campbell tried to be honest, tried to reconstruct his thought process from 4 decades earlier, but he admitted there were gaps, things he couldn't quite remember, emotions that had faded with time. The fear was still there. He could access that, but the specifics of the moment were blurry now. What remained sharp was the responsibility, the weight of 9 lives depending on his choice. That hadn't faded at all. He still felt it, still woke up sometimes thinking about what would have happened if he'd made a different call, if he'd ordered the bailout. 9 men scattered over Germany, some captured, some killed, none making it home. The counterfactual haunted him even after all these years, but he'd made the right choice. He knew that intellectually. The outcome proved it. 9 men lived, had families, careers, full lives. The math was simple, but emotionally, the weight never fully lifted. The researcher understood. She'd interviewed enough veterans to recognize survivors' guilt, the irrational feeling that you didn't deserve to make it when others didn't, even when you'd done everything right, even when you'd saved lives instead of losing them. She asked Campbell what he wanted people to remember about Bremen. He thought for a long time, then said, "I want them to know that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that we're all capable of more than we think, and that the hard choices are the ones that matter most. Anyone can make easy decisions, but when everything is falling apart and you have seconds to act, that's when you find out who you really are." The interview was archived at the Smithsonian, Campbell's voice preserved for future generations. His account of that day in February 1943, the technical details and the human details, all of it recorded, saved. The researcher sent him a copy of the recording. Campbell listened to it once, heard his own voice describing events that seemed like they'd happened to someone else. Was that really him? That young pilot fighting a dying bomber over the North Sea? It seemed impossible. A story. Fiction. But it wasn't. It was real. The evidence existed. The photographs. The mission reports. The memories of 5 old men scattered across America. It happened. Campbell's health started declining in the late 1980s. Nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion of age. Arthritis in his hands from all those hours on the controls. High blood pressure. The beginning of heart disease. His doctor told him to slow down. Retire from teaching. Take it easy. Campbell ignored the advice. He was still flying at 68, still taking students up, still teaching the basics of aviation to anyone willing to learn. Flying was who he was. He couldn't imagine stopping. What would he do? Sit at home and wait to die? That wasn't living. But his wife worried, saw him struggling with tasks that used to be easy, saw the pain in his hands when he gripped the yoke. She begged him to retire, to rest, to enjoy the time they had left. Campbell promised he'd think about it. He didn't think about it. He kept flying. In May 1989, Campbell took up his last student. A young woman named Sarah Patterson, 22 years old, wanted to learn to fly because her grandfather had been a bomber pilot in the war, had told her stories about the B-17, about missions over Germany, about the men who flew them. Campbell liked her immediately. She was serious, focused, asked good questions, reminded him of himself 45 years earlier, eager to learn, respectful of the aircraft, understanding that flying was both art and science. They flew together for 3 weeks. Campbell taught her the fundamentals, how to feel the aircraft, how to read the sky, how to make decisions based on incomplete information. She was a natural, picked things up quickly, had good instincts. On their final flight together, Campbell told her about Bremen, the whole story. He'd never done that with a student before, never shared the personal details, but something about Sarah made him want to pass it on, to give her the lesson directly. She listened in silence. They were at 4,000 feet, clear skies, perfect flying weather. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You saved 9 lives that day, but really you saved hundreds, maybe thousands. All the people those 9 men touched, all the children and grandchildren, the students you've taught. The ripples just keep spreading." Campbell hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't calculated the downstream effects, but she was right. The decision he'd made in 1943 had echoes that reached into 1989 and beyond. Every life he'd saved had created more life, more possibility, more future. Sarah soloed a week later, passed her check ride on the first attempt. When she came down, she hugged Campbell, said he was the best instructor she could have asked for, that she'd carry his lessons forever. Campbell went home that day feeling satisfied, complete. He'd passed something on. The chain continued, student to teacher to student, the knowledge surviving. He died in his sleep 2 weeks later, June 15, 1989. His heart gave out. No pain, no struggle, just a quiet ending to a remarkable life. The funeral was massive. Hundreds of people, former students, veterans, community members. The 4 surviving crew members from All American all attended. Chen, Ramirez, O'Brien, Morrison, old men now, walking slowly, but they came. For Campbell, for their pilot, for the man who'd given them everything. The service was military, honor guard, flag-draped coffin, taps played on a bugle, but the eulogies were personal. Each speaker talked about what Campbell had meant to them, how he'd changed their lives, what he'd taught them. Chen spoke last. He was 73, still strong, still clear-minded. He walked to the front of the church and looked at the coffin for a long moment. Then he turned to the crowd. "Bob Campbell saved my life," he said. "That's a simple fact. February 26, 1943, over Bremen, Germany. He made a choice that let me live. And for the last 46 years, I've tried to honor that choice, to live a life that justified his decision. I don't know if I succeeded, but I tried." His voice cracked. He paused, gathered himself. "But here's what you need to understand. Bob didn't just save 9 men that day. He saved everyone we touched. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, every customer who came into my restaurant, every person I helped, every kindness I showed. None of that happens if Bob gives the bailout order. None of it exists." He looked at the other 3 crew members. They were nodding, tears on their faces. "So when you remember Bob Campbell, don't just remember a war hero. Remember a man who created futures, who gave life instead of taking it, who showed us what's possible when you refuse to quit." The church was silent. Then someone started clapping, like before, building slowly, until everyone was standing, applauding, for Campbell, for what he represented, for the simple truth that one person's courage can echo across generations. They buried Campbell with military honors. The flag was folded and presented to his widow. 21-gun salute, taps, the ancient rituals that honor those who served. But the real memorial was in the lives he'd touched, the students he'd taught, the men he'd saved, the legacy that spread outward like ripples on water. Sarah Patterson became a commercial pilot, flew for United Airlines for 30 years. And when she trained new pilots, she told them about Campbell, about Bremen, about the B-17 with half a wing that made it home. The story continued. Another generation, another transmission. Chen lived until 2003, 87 years old. He ran his restaurant almost until the end. And on the wall behind the cash register, next to the photo of All American, he hung a second photo. Campbell, young, in his flight suit, standing in front of a B-17, smiling. Customers would ask about both photos. Chen would tell them the story. Sometimes the short version, sometimes the long one, depending on how much time he had. But he always ended the same way. "That man gave me my life, everything I have. Everything I am, I owe to him. Simple, true. The distillation of everything Bremen meant. Ramirez died in 1997, O'Brien in 2001, Morrison in 2008. One by one, the crew of All American passed. The men who'd shared that impossible flight, who'd trusted Campbell and been proven right, who'd carried the memory for decades. By 2010, they were all gone, all 9, the last living connections to that February day in 1943. The mission existed now only in records and photographs and second-hand accounts. The emotional truth was lost. The fear and the determination and the relief, gone with the men who'd felt it. But the story survived. Historians wrote about it. Aviation enthusiasts studied it. The photographs circulated online. New generations discovered All American and marveled at the damage and wondered how it was possible. The technical answer was available. Engineering analyses, structural reports, calculations of stress and lift and control authority, all the data that explained how the bomber stayed airborne. But the real answer was simpler. It was possible because Campbell believed it was, because he refused to accept the alternative, because 9 men trusted him, and he honored that trust with every ounce of skill and courage he possessed. That's not engineering, that's humanity. And humanity, when pushed to its limits, is capable of remarkable things. The Air Force Museum in Dayton has an exhibit on the B-17. Among the artifacts and photographs is a large image of All American with her damaged wing. Visitors stop and stare, read the placard, learn the basic facts. Some move on quickly, others linger, trying to imagine what it must have been like, what it must have felt like to be in that aircraft, to make that choice. They can't really know. None of us can unless we've been there, but we can honor it. We can remember it. We can take the lesson and apply it to our own lives. When we face our impossible moments, when everything says quit, when the easy path is to surrender, we can remember Campbell, remember All American, remember that someone else refused to accept defeat and created a future that shouldn't exist. And maybe, just maybe, we can do the same. That's the power of these stories. Not that they make us heroes, but that they show us heroism is possible, that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can rise to meet the challenge, that we all have reserves we haven't tapped, capacities we haven't tested. Campbell proved it. 9 men lived because he proved it, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren exist because he proved it. That's not just a war story. That's a story about human potential, about what we can achieve when we refuse to accept limits, about the power of skill and courage and stubborn determination. It's a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing on. Because somewhere, right now, someone is facing their own damaged wing, their own impossible situation, their own moment of choice. And they need to know that continuing is possible, that they can fight the controls for as long as it takes, that they can make it home. Campbell showed them how. 76 years ago, over the frozen North Sea, a farm kid from Nebraska pushed the throttles forward and said, "We're not done yet." And he was right. They made it home, all 9, against physics, against logic, against every reasonable expectation. They made it home because 1 man believed they could, and 9 men believed in him. That's the story, simple, powerful, true. The B-17 with half a wing came home, and in doing so, it proved something that transcends aviation and engineering and military history. It proved that the human spirit, when tested, is capable of miracles, not the supernatural kind, the everyday kind, the kind that happens when courage meets necessity and produces outcomes that shouldn't exist. Campbell's miracle wasn't walking on water. It was keeping All American in the air for 2 hours when everyone said it was impossible. It was fighting the controls until his arms went numb. It was landing that bomber so gently that some called it the smoothest touchdown they'd ever seen. It was doing the job when the job seemed impossible. That's all. That's everything. And it's why we remember, why we tell the story, why we honor the men who were there. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were profoundly, remarkably human, flawed and scared and determined to do right by each other, to get home, to survive, to live. Campbell gave them that chance, took the responsibility, made the choice, and followed through with every bit of skill he possessed. 9 men lived, the ripples spread, the story survived. And somewhere, someone reading this or hearing this will face their own impossible moment. And they'll remember the B-17 with half a wing, and they'll push their own throttles forward, and maybe, just maybe, they'll make it home too. That's Campbell's legacy, not just what he did, but what he showed us we could do. The impossible, made real, one decision at a time.